Right. Morning, everyone. This is William from AV News with Sarl from the Critical Sessions, or in fact, as he calls himself, the Critical Podcast. And today we're continuing our series that Sarl and I have engaged with over the last couple of weeks. This is episode 3. And today, Sarl, we are going to be discussing sound stages. And this in the context of stereo music is quite a broad topic and has quite a bit of technical detail that I think we are going to get ourselves stuck into. And I suppose the easiest way to start is to ask ourselves, what is a soundstage?
100%. Thank you, William. I'm Sorrel, obviously, and call me SP for short. Sound staging, that is, hopefully we won't make this controversial, but it might be a bit of a controversial topic because there are lots of differing opinions, and hopefully today will be the bolts to nuts to soup version of unpacking why sound stages exist. An interesting topic that I stumbled across in my research for this specific episode of the podcast, William, is one on hearing. Now, probably the more well-known source in the world is OSHA in the US, when it gets to safety and all that type of stuff. And I was a little bit taken aback, I guess, when I discovered in reading some of the hearing loss prevention things on OSHA that their standard for hearing protection was not set to what everybody believes for hearing protection. It was set to such a level that at the end of your working career, you could still hold, in a noisy environment, obviously, you can still hold a conversation at a 1 meter distance and still hear what the conversation is in a quiet environment. So it wasn't done for hearing protection, really, because it allows a huge amount of hearing loss to occur in the workplace. It was just for efficiency of work delivery, so that people can hear each other and not cause serious accidents and incidents. So that's just on hearing. And the reason why I bring that up is, and we'll cover that a little bit later, there is a specific type of hearing loss which will prevent us from being able to perceive a virtual soundstage. And not just perceive a virtual one, also in real life, not being able to spatially locate and reference sound sources the way that we think most people can. Especially if there's lots of other background noise and the signal to noise ratio once again gets on that hearing limit, then people lose the ability. Ordinarily, if you don't suffer from this type of hearing loss, you won't be losing it. You can still locate the sounds, but certain people don't have the ability. And it is actually a medical classification that some people can't hear a soundstage.
And there's an interesting word there that you're using, which is locate. And locate and soundstage are generally used often in the same sentence. We locate the soundstage. And within the soundstage, we locate the different instruments and the different voices. And that's how we generate the illusion of reality using our stereo imaging systems, our speakers and our HiFi that we love and enjoy. And it's part of that I think integrates in terms of understanding what a soundstage is. It's basically a medium or a virtual picture, as you've pointed it out, within which we locate our music.
Quite correct. And what we are going to delve into a little bit is obviously how that functions, why we have the ability, and how that works, and what influenced the hi-fi equipment, the gear that we use to do the playback, loudspeakers, the room, and all of those things, what influence they may have on a soundstage and on the location of the individual components within that soundstage. And if the gear is really all that important in comparison to the loudspeakers, to placement, and to just the mechanics of the recording itself. So we'll unpack those things a little bit. I think another thing...
I just have to say there that, when it comes to impacting, well, equipment impacting on the sound stage and the sound quality, At the moment, I'm listening to a pair of speakers that have no speaker cables. They're completely wireless.
So what you are then,
What I'm listening to at the moment and what I'm thinking about are very sort of interesting thoughts about, where do we really draw the line in terms of what's absolutely necessary and what isn't? And can we hear the differences between the two?
yes,
And I must confess, Sarah, I'll be honest, when we do get to the speaker cable discussion, I have not been brave enough yet to test this in an A/B situation.
I don't blame you. I think it was in the first episode that I mentioned how important cables are, because if you cut one of the two wires going to the speaker or from a source to a preamp, that shows you how important cables are. But there's the opposite side of that as well. And
yeah.
you've gone wireless, so
We've got some interesting discussions coming up.
yes. And I think maybe prior to doing that specific episode, it might be worth your while to do the A/B so that you can give some personal opinion.
It's going to be a challenge, I have to say, because actually the system I'm listening to is a mission setup, the Mission LXs, and they do actually make a wide bookshelf speaker of almost exactly the same sort of
The same
specs and
driver, same
dimensions.
cabinet.
So it might be possible. I'll speak very nicely to Balanced Audio, who are the distributors for this, if they would consider that we could do that.
Yes.
It could be quite an interesting listening exercise.
It might be worth your while to point them to this podcast so that at least they get a sense of how we tackle things and what we do.
Sure.
But that would be an interesting one, definitely. I think I want to preface this specific episode by two statements. The first one is, we don't yet know everything there is to know about hearing, about listening, about sound reproduction. There are still things that are unclear, that are debatable. So what we are saying is not cast in stone for obvious reasons, because somebody may discover something tomorrow which chucks out everything that we've stated up here. And then the second thing is, the way that we are approaching sound staging is different to anything I have over a period of time trawled the internet, YouTube, Twitter, all the HiFi forums, the DIY forums, as to how people discuss sound staging and imaging, and nobody is discussing it from a fundamentals perspective like this episode is going to. So it is going to be hopefully a little bit thought-provoking, and not just information that we share. And this is not a scary episode. That I'm not bringing in any formulas to do any calculations. I do mention a couple of numbers, but I mean, those things are easy. Getting right back into the question that you asked right in the beginning is, what are sound stagings?
Yeah.
Sound staging is really an illusion. It's a virtual, and I think most people understand the concept of virtual reality. And a virtual sound stage is the sound stage that is actually formed in our head. Now, the thing is, if you go to a live concert or to a live venue where musicians perform, you still form the virtual image. There is a real one right in front of you. If you close your eyes, you can still position for a large part the instruments in the sound stage and the vocals. But on reproduction, what we strive for is, and some people call it, the loudspeakers disappear. You just hear the sound stage. The loudspeakers are not the point source, and your ears don't locate the speakers themselves. And that is a good indication that your whole system is functioning properly when you don't hear the speakers and you don't sense their position. That is indeed true. But the sound stage in our heads, even at a live venue, is still just a virtual sound stage in our head where our brains position what it is that we perceive. In exactly the same way, hopefully the system performs well enough that we will recreate that sound stage in our listening environment, if it's a reasonable recording. Now, I have consciously made the decision to utilize where I'm sitting right now. This is my editing suite. I've got two powered loudspeakers, two-way speakers. They're about 1.4 meters apart, the center tweeter to tweeter spacing, and they are positioned about a meter from where I'm sitting at the moment. So it's not quite a unilateral triangle, and it's way smaller than people always recommend that the speakers be placed. And I can promise you, this forms a decent soundstage. It's not. I guess you can get better than this, but most definitely this is, as far as I'm concerned, a very, very good soundstage that has been formed. And the speakers are not very far apart, and I'm very close to the speakers. This room is not treated. The speakers, I have subsequently placed all the speakers on isolation foam. So just to make sure that when I do this for the specific episode, that I could properly evaluate if this can form a soundstage. So you don't need a big space. You don't need much to form one.
There are two things I can add to that. The one is that when one's listening critically, one tends to close one's eyes.
You do.
and I think that just goes back to the fact that then you're allowing your visual senses not to take in and influence the virtual reality that your ears are perceiving. So it's interesting that when I find myself at a live concert, and I mean a live performance where you have recordings a la a classical concert, as opposed to a music concert where you have recording engineers blasting sound all over the places through speakers. We have natural instruments creating the music for you. When I close my eyes and create the soundstage there, and when I open my eyes and I actually listen to the performers playing, it's interesting that it takes a little bit of getting used to, but you can actually train yourself to listen to systems with your eyes open.
Yes, you can.
And it's quite a thing. I still find that if I'm really confused or if I'm really looking for subtleties, my eyes just close. It's just this instinct that I have. And the other thing about sound staging, we'll get back to eyes now, is that certainly sound staging, and in terms of my understanding of it anyway, is that was blown away for me inside a car. So I was listening to a really well set up, well orchestrated car with the speakers about that far away from me, and the soundstage was on the other side of the car's bonnet. So, you know, the relative what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of prejudgments or understandings that we have may not necessarily actually come to the fore when one's actually listening to sound staging. It is possible, as you say, to generate a sound stage that's perfectly adequate from a situation that's not what one would consider optimal.
Yes, indeed. DSPs do play a certain role in that. And as you said, in closing your eyes, beg your pardon, I've got a froggy this morning. I think one of the reasons why we close our eyes is to isolate our sense of hearing and not get the confused, and that gets back to the last episode where we said the senses work together. They don't work in isolation. So that's one of the reasons, I believe, why we close our eyes when we do specifically critical listening, is because of the fact that our sense of sight will influence what we hear when we do critical listening. So that's the reason. And I think it's a universal thing. Most people that I've spoken to, and I'm pretty sure that you have, do close their eyes when they do critical listening to be able to focus solely on the sounds. So quite understandably so. So is sound staging and imaging important? Well, as with many things in life, that depends. If you listen on a mobile device with a single speaker, no sound staging goes away. It's not important. if sound staging is just simply not important to you as an individual in casual listening or whatever the case may be, then no, sound staging is not everything in HiFi. It doesn't have to be, but that depends on the individual. For a lot of people, a large part of the enjoyment is the soundstage. For me personally, sound staging is somewhat important because sometimes I enjoy listening to music and enjoying the soundstage and trying to pinpoint where what is unconsciously most of the time, but still it may or it may not be. So don't get too hung up on what we are saying here today. If you one of the mono vinyl listeners, then sound staging obviously is not consequential at all. For a lot of people with a nice room and nice equipment, and the enjoyment comes partially from enjoying the soundstage and the imaging. So absolutely. For critical listening, I do believe for myself that sound staging and imaging is important when it gets to critical listening. When I really want to sit down and enjoy, focus on the activity, then for sure, sound staging is important.
Yeah, it's a relative measure of performance.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. So then let's talk a little bit about psychoacoustics, which is really at the heart of anything audio engineering, because people did some rudimentary research a long time ago and discovered certain things in psychoacoustic analysis and research that formed the basis of a lot of what we are able to do today. The internet, sound reproduction via the internet, via YouTube or Spotify or any other streaming services, is because of psychoacoustic research. And that is why we, in the beginning, when we didn't have a lot of bandwidth, MP3, the codec was very successful. And what the researchers did at the Fraunhofer Institute, where they developed this, was they had a look at psychoacoustics and the Haas effect, the President's effect, and a couple of other things, where certain information is discarded by our ears. So if they could discard that information in encoding the music, they could drastically reduce the file sizes so that it can be digitally transported, digitally stored for our enjoyment. And hence the reason why MP3 originally took the market almost completely. That was the de facto standard. Today we don't have the same problems we had 20 and 30 years ago. So the scenario and the situation has obviously changed completely. So a lot of the practical acoustical problems is associated with buildings and structures and reflections and many other things that can compromise, obviously, our sound. So psychoacoustics is also important in helping us understand when we do play either in a live venue or reproductively in our homes doing critical listening, what the influences of all the things around our loudspeakers and our bodies, ourselves, what those things are and how it influences what we are listening to. And the bulk of the research is to allow us to improve various things like invent stereo recording, to be able to capture and be able to reproduce the sound stage, to understand room modes, the dampening, the treatment of rooms acoustically, to be able to do better critical listening to a higher level and get more of what we may believe, correctly or incorrectly, what the producer and the recording artist intended originally with whatever the sources that we are listening to. So to be able to do that type of research, one of the things that is, I think, very important and what people try to do is to recreate a space. And I jokingly said in the first episode, or the second one, we don't drag our hi-fi gear into the garden to listen, which is partially true, well, mostly true, I guess. But we need an environment that is free of reflections and all the bad things that rooms and buildings and all of that create. Funny enough, recordings are mostly done, probably 80%, excluding obviously live recordings, but most of the other recordings are done inside of buildings, inside of well-treated rooms. And they do exhibit a lot of these psychoacoustic artifacts. They do get treated to reduce those, but we live with those no matter where we are, no matter how we approach this. So as a community doing the research in audio, we created something called a free space. That's a free field, rather, is the correct technical term. That is almost like an open field. It is indeed an open field, but it is a very large open field. Now, as an example, I'll bring up the Loftus Stadium. That is an open field. Most of these are, but they do have an echo, which means it's not a free field. Now, if we look at loudspeakers and microphones, they also do have a near field, an intermediate field, and a far field, which is slightly different to what we are referring to here. The free field in this case is there are no reflections. So if you make a sound in the middle of this free field, you will not be hearing any echoes, reflections, or anything. There is the unfortunate situation that you have to stand on the ground, but when people do this as a reference, in actual fact, what they do is they will put a long pole with a microphone on top and other poles with speakers on top, and then do whatever test they do. And they use this actually as a proper anechoic free field, and they will evaluate anechoic rooms and do the compensation based on what the free field response was. They'll subtract it from an anechoic chamber or room, and they will use that as the basis within half a dB or whatever the case may be to qualify that room and do the research.
So now when we have our recording engineer sitting in the studio putting together our music for us, where we have part technical and part art meeting, and the eventual result being our recording that we then listen to via Tidal, Spotify, or vinyl or CD or whatever the case may be, is the construct of what that engineer actually wants us to hear. And based on his understanding of what you've just said about creating a completely neutral environment, could or could not influence what it is that we understand as being the perfect recording or not. We're in their hands to a far higher degree than maybe we give credit to these guys before. And isn't it interesting? I find that, you know, people are very taken with recordings that are done by specific artists, yet we don't follow recordings done by specific recording engineers.
The funny thing there, William, and it's a very good point that you've made. Mostly, it's not exclusively so, but musicians will go to the same recording engineer because they like the sound. So to a large extent, if you like a specific artist and their music, you by default frequently get the same recording facility, the same recording engineer doing the mastering and all of that. But you are absolutely correct in stating that the recording engineers and the mastering engineers, we are in their hands, and they don't necessarily get from the listening community the credit that they really deserve, because that is where the live recording is made or not. Certain mastering engineers are renowned worldwide, and people will fly halfway across the world to do a recording with them, because they just understand how the process works. Their engineering studios, control rooms, all of those things are of such a high standard that they can really apply their art to this artist and make them a huge success. So
I, I, I'll tell you what's triggered that train of thought was the fact that I've listened to several recordings of Mozart's concerto number, whatever it was, 21, 27, 28, quite a few of them in different venues. And the venue itself, as we say, makes an influence. But I found that the actual recording engineer and the way it was recorded has far more of an influence than the actual venue did. Now, what I now need to do, of course, is fly to all these different venues, listen to those specific recordings with that specific or those specific concerts with those specific people, and then listen to the recording thereafter to be able to influence which engineer is the best or came across as projecting music I want the way I wanted to hear it, which is as natural and as encompassing as that venue is.
yes.
So it opens up a whole new different level of understanding behind what it is we're actually listening to. And I think I hope I'm not jumping the gun here, but if I'm inferring from what I'm hearing correctly, is that the sound staging that we generate here is actually a large function of the recording engineer, far more than the actual venue itself necessarily. So if for instance we're recording in an acoustically neutral room, how do you create a soundstage in an acoustically neutral room?
Exactly the same way as you do in a non-neutral room, and we'll dive into that a little bit. That actually would warrant a whole 3 or 4 different episodes on stereo recording methods, and there are a whole host of those, and what the room sounds
sorry,
like. No
I tend to
problem.
do this.
There is the
so much to
influence.
cover.
Yeah, there is the influence of the room on the recording for obvious reasons because it's recorded live. But a lot of music is not recorded live in that sense. The drum track is isolated. All the various parts, the hi-hat, the bass, everything is mic'd individually, and they even use different microphones on each one of those to bring out the sound that the recording engineer, that artist, what he prefers to hear in conjunction with the artists themselves. So all of those things, and then in the mix down is where they create the sound that the artist wants. I mean, there are silly tools like the octave shifters. So if you sing and it's slightly off key, they just bump you through this thing, or they change your key completely, and you can't hear that on the receiving side. When we listen, you will never say this octave of the vocal was changed. You just can't. So obviously, from a recording engineer's perspective, they would want to individually to carve their niche in the market and produce the music that they like to produce, or at least to master. Let me rather say master. So as many songs as there are probably about half as many mastering engineers and artists out in the world, and their influence is undeniable on the music that we listen to. They've got a huge impact on it. It's not just the artist. The artist is the creative person, but that doesn't take away from the creativity of the mastering engineer at all. They are crucial in this. And hence there are such a large amount of different types of music. Apart from the fact that we like to listen to different things, there is definitely the influence of those engineers on the music itself. So the picture of the free field is just to give you an idea of what people really mean by a free field. There are no solid objects around anywhere. The ground is fairly flat and not hard, preferably grassy, so that there's not a lot of reflection, and the taller the grass is, funny enough, the better it would be. The main reason people use the free field in an open field is to better understand the fundamentals of audio, of sound waves, of noise, and whatever else. So in a free field, the sound waves radiate equally and never gets reflected at all, apart from on the ground. But if you're on a high pole, then you can discount that because the level of the reflection then becomes so low that it's really immaterial. And most of the research that people do, there is a famous picture of someone doing some audio research on the building rooftop, and they had a lift shaft sticking above the rest of the top of the building, and the poor chap that was the research subject was strapped into a chair on top of that thing, and all the equipment was on the top of the building roof in the middle of somewhere in America in the 40s or the 50s. So it's quite a funny picture. I'll see if I can dig out the picture. It's actually
The pursuit of science.
yeah. So that's the length that people go to get into an anechoic environment so that we can understand the fundamentals. And the anechoic environment is a very bad listening experience. You struggle with everything. Everything sounds too soft. It's easy to damage your hearing in such an environment. It's a very unnatural environment for us, because at least we are used to, if we out in the veld somewhere in the flat, in the Free State, you always have the ground beneath your feet. So you get those reflections. Inside vehicles we get, inside buildings we get. So even inside caves hundreds of thousands of years ago, you get reflections. So from a river, if you bend over in a river to drink water and there's sound, the sound reflects from the top of the water. So that's what we are used to. So I think now, having discussed all of that, we need to get into how a sound stage is created, the real nuts and bolts, the physics of it. And to a large extent, there are just two things really that, and I'm not talking about reproduction yet, this is live out in the world. There are two things that we rely on to be able to form that virtual image in our heads. We've already established that anything at listening distance is a point source. And that point source we listen to binaurally with both our ears in stereo, in other words. What happens is when somebody speaks at the same level, the same volume of voice, and walk away from you backwards, let's say for the time being, we can easily determine that even by closing our eyes and not hearing footsteps, we'll be able to realize that because the speaking volume is the same, as the person recedes from us, the volume gets lower, which our brains naturally has been conditioned to translate into it as further. In reproducing the sound stage and the imaging, louder sounds appear closer than softer sounds. Although they may not physically be further away, softer sounds appear further away. So that is the one way that our brains interpret volume or loudness information, is softer to our brain in a soundstage, and imaging an individual musical instrument or singer or whatever is further away. Now, if it's voice that we listen to, if I suddenly speak softer, it doesn't mean that necessarily I'm further away. We can hear the difference and realize that the person is just talking softer or singing softer. It's not necessarily moving away from us. Other things like a vehicle driving past, we will understand that it's moving without even open eyes. We do understand that it's driving away at a rate of knots, whatever the case may be. So
how do we do that? I mean, I find that absolutely fascinating, because exactly as you said that, it was a case of we understand that the person is speaking softer, not that they're further away. But we know that.
And
it boggles my mind.
Our ears and our listening, so the hearing and the listening is so finely attuned to the volume differences, but also in the information when we pronounce words, or when a singer sings a song and they reduce the level, everything inside producing that sound changes, the timbre of the sound changes, how explosive the plosives are changed. It becomes much less so, and our brain understands that because we've seen more than enough interactions between humans to understand exactly the difference between those things. If somebody is very close to your ear and whispers something in your ear, you know by feeling the heat of their body right next to you that this person is very, very close, and they won't, well, normally apart, if you want to give somebody a fright, you won't speak loudly if your mouth is right next to their ear. We've all done that bit as well. Well, I have. Certainly. So,
Do you have a 9-year-old?
a 13-year-old, yes.
Well,
Same.
9-year-olds have suddenly realized rushing up to you and going, "Wow!" in your ear whilst you're busy watching TV is a joyous source of endless entertainment.
Yes, it most definitely is.
And unfortunately, I'm at an age now where a swift right hand around the ear is beyond because he's just too fast to get away.
Well, that's just that sets off more laughter, I guess, at the end of the day. So it is as simple as that. Imaging and soundstage, when it gets to distance, is literally just volume. Interesting, our ears are formed in a certain way, and sounds in front of us at the same distance and the same volume will sound louder than sounds behind us with exactly the same volume and same distance, because our ears are attuned to detecting things in the front 180 or a bit more, let's say 270 degrees, but it's more efficient in the front 180, and especially the front 90 degrees it's much more efficient than behind us, and our brains understand that. That's why frequently, imperceptibly, we move our heads to move our ears to locate something that is behind us. Exactly the same way we've all seen dogs turning their heads sideways when they're trying to figure out what sounds they are hearing, and it's for exactly the same reason. It's just for locating what the sound source is. They're not more inquisitive, they're just trying to determine where this thing is making the noise. Hopefully they can go there and catch it and eat it for lunch or something. But yeah, so literally, so if we now understand that, and there is enough research that we know this as an absolute law of physics, if sounds that are softer is perceived to be further away. So the recording artist, the mastering engineer really is the person that's in control of the relative volume, and they will utilize that volume to help them build a soundstage. Just like we enjoy sound stages, they understand that in stereo listening, that's one of the fundamentals. They have to create a soundstage to make it somewhat realistic for the listener, that because if we enjoy what they are doing more, the recording engineer, the mastering engineer, and the artist in conjunction with each other, now I go bumping my microphones here, if they understand very well that if we enjoy what they are doing, we will be buying more of the same next time. So it's completely in their interest to ensure that they create music for our enjoyment, and that includes that virtual soundstage. They are doing everything, most of them, the successful ones anyhow, to be able to ensure that we do have a pleasurable experience in critical listening, and we can enjoy that soundstage. Because the more believable it is, the better the chance are. If the artist is coming to wherever to do a live concert, we will go there and enjoy an even better experience, because now we're amongst other social creatures there that enjoy the same thing that we do. So it's 100%. Absolutely in their interest to do that. So a couple of things I think that is important is the integration, and I'll get to the second part of sound staging and how that is created in our minds. But before I do that, motion pictures, movies as we like to call them, they fool our brains all the time, because it's a bunch of still images, and I'll flash up a little moving picture manual made thingy. I don't want to give it away until it flashes up on screen, but if we play back a set of still images in rapid succession, at least 16 times per second, our brains are slow enough and our visual system is slow enough that it'll integrate those 16 images into a somewhat jerky movement, and we think we are seeing someone moving. It's not really, we are just seeing a bunch of consecutive still images that has been snapped of a person busy moving. We've standardized on movies at 24 frames per second to give us a realistic view. That's called the film look. 25 frames or 50 frames in the PAL world, and 30 or 29.97, whatever, normally called 30 frames, or 60 frames, 59 point whatever, for NTSC systems. And that is to allow us to see movies and have another type of visual virtual experience. But guess what? Most movie producers and producers for television and consumption on YouTube realize that sound is more than 50% of the movie. So you can look at the images, but if the sound doesn't support what the images are trying to convey, you lose the realism and you lose interest in watching, because it just does not, your brain is telling you this does not make sense. If somebody gives you a punch, they use Foley and ADR, dialogue replacement and things like that in the professional world to be able to make the sound. That's why you get the overblown, over-the-top sounds with movies, to attempt to make it realistic for us in experiencing it. If you pick up that it is, the sound is too big, it's too much, then that distracts again. So now you realize that this is artificial, it doesn't belong. So the fine art is in striking that balance, but the balance is always, sound is more than 50% of the movie. It's a universally recognized thing there. So
I just want to add to that, that if we could please implore New Metro and Sturkinic, or whatever they call themselves these days, to use a few more sound engineers to understand that it's not necessarily about 200 decibels in any given movie. It's about adhering to what the actual movie guide tells you the volume levels should be. Use that, because what you said speaks absolutely true. We watched, as one does, Top Gun Maverick, as one does. And then, of course, you watch the original Top Gun, and you realize that the original Top Gun's claim to fame was there was no storyline to it, but the visual special effects, and specifically the sound effects in that movie, I think are up there with the best of its generation.
Yeah.
They were loud when they needed to be, soft when they needed to be, and the whole thing was this absolute knee-jerk, immediate gut instinct reaction to, that's authentic. That's what it's going to be like to fly an F-14 on an aircraft carrier, and I think that's what just sold that movie. What sold it for me, anyway, hands down.
And it's the closest we get to experiencing what those guys experience, or goals.
100%.
So
100%.
that's
and
part
one
of
the stats. One of the stats that came out of that movie is that after Top Gun, the original, was released, naval intake recruits that year increased by 500%.
Oh, there you go. Now we can understand why. It makes perfect sense.
Just because of the sound.
Yes, because of the sound. That visceral experience that you get, which is kind of close to what it is in reality, but never quite matches. We strive to improve it.
We strive, exactly. That's what we aim for.
That's probably some of the best human traits, is the fact that we always strive to improve ourselves, hopefully. That's what makes us human.
Absolutely.
But anyhow, so the reason for mentioning movies and the integration that our brains use to integrate the various still images into a moving image is our ears does exactly the same thing. It's got an integration time. That integration time is about 35 milliseconds, which is 35 100ths of a second. And sounds that reach our ears during that period is normally perceived as a single sound. If the same sound would reach our ears much beyond 50 milliseconds, now there's a gray area in between, but much beyond 50 milliseconds, that we perceive in a large hall, as an example, is an echo. Our brains understand that it's not anything original. It has arrived due to various reflections. That's part of the room modes, and what gives that room the characteristic. If we go to a public restroom and it's a tiny cubicle, the sound response there is completely different than what it would be inside a stadium like Loftus, as I showed earlier, or to your listening room. And an untreated listening room, the response, the room sound itself is completely different to when it is treated. Frequently, when we do recordings, I've got a bit of a noise problem in this environment. And what I do is I record about 10 seconds of not speaking, that room sound, because I need to use the room sound to be able to filter out some of the noise. So that is the room sound to a large extent. Also, when speaking, you can hear that I'm in a fairly big room. I'm not in a tiny place, except if I do this, then obviously the room goes away, but it sounds bad because the plosives will overdrive the microphone and it'll give bad response, which is something that everybody has to contend with in recording music as well. So I've now covered very briefly the integration time of our ears. Now, right in the beginning, I said the width of our ear and the height of our ear is important as well, because that creates a filter on each side of our head, and all the various waves interact with each other. That creates a continuously moving band pass filter, which means it cuts some of the bottom end, some of the top end, and it's got a bandwidth. There's a certain number of frequencies that falls within the band and the rest will fall off. And all of that is highly, vitally important for us to be able to do sound location in space around us, above us, behind us, in front of us, below, or slightly above. It's immaterial. That is what is really what we use to be able to do that. So if we think about, we've all done the little ruler sound creation thing, where if you put a ruler on the table and it overhangs, and you hit the overhang, depending on the length, the distance, and the material that the ruler is made of, it'll make a certain sound. I beg your pardon. So to be able to understand how we hear, if we take that ruler, we make a specific high-pitched sound by, for example, slapping the ruler on the table once. That has got a certain frequency content in it, but it also appears just once. If I now do this consecutively, let's say 120 times per second, if I could move that fast, you will perceive that as a musical note. So anything between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz is a musical note. So that one slap is called an impulse sound. That impulse sound, if I do that faster, let's say 5 times a second, that's not 5 times, that's about 5 times a second or whatever it is. But that sound, although it's got its tonal characteristics, and we know I've used my finger on a wooden table to do that, we recognize that sound. That is, the frequency of doing it is below what we can normally hear. The only reason we can hear it is because of the harmonic content of whatever I've done. So if we take a pure sound sine wave and we play the sine wave at 20 hertz, or let's say 100 hertz, that's a musical note. That's the fundamental, because it's a pure sound. There's a pure sine. There is no harmonic content in that. There's no distortion, let's assume, for this example. If we play that at 20 hertz, some people can still hear that. Not all of us can, but some people can still hear that. If we play it at 5 hertz, which is the same as this, but it's just a pure sine wave with no harmonic content, we cannot hear that. We've established that when we discussed the ear and the cochlea and how we listen.
Yes.
We can't hear that, but we can still perceive if it's loud enough, there's enough pressure information, we can still feel that and detect that information. So that's all the sub-bass information, which is below the threshold, or infrasound is probably the correct technical term, and we cannot hear that sound. The same holds for 20,000 hertz. Above that, it's called the ultrasonic region, and people's ears cannot detect that. I don't think we've got any sense that can detect much above 20 kilohertz. So that sound is still sound. It's still considered sound, ultrasonic. And that is what people use to do crack detection in metals. And you send your wife for ultrasonic scan if you're pregnant. So, well, if she's pregnant, not you, hopefully. But it is a useful technical tool. It is just that our ears are not able to do that. Now, you mentioned in one of the previous episodes about amplifier bandwidth, and some amplifiers going to 40 or 80 kilohertz. There are technical reasons for that. People may mistake that as the amplifier will perform better because you can hear the upper frequencies. It can reproduce those, but most digital sounds has got a brick wall filter at 20.5 to 21 kilohertz anyhow. It just cuts everything off there. There are technical reasons for that. We don't have to go into those, but sufficient to say that ultrasonics we're not possible. It does reach our ears, the ultrasonic sounds, but we can't interpret them. So we hear them, but we can't listen to those. Big difference. And not being able to listen to it makes it so that you don't have to attempt to reproduce it, because that's wasted energy.
Sure.
From a musical perspective as well, 16 to 18 kilohertz is borderline musical information that we can enjoy. A lot of the information there is not really enjoyable information, and indeed mastering engineers will attempt to reduce that. If we look at the internet in general, I mean, for YouTube as an example, most of their audio is cut at about 16 kilohertz. Anything this out on YouTube, 16 kilohertz is the maximum frequency content that YouTube will reproduce afterwards. So there is that limit as well. We've established some of the truths and some of the physical laws that allow us to be able to understand imaging. We've discussed volume. Now, the second one is timing. And this is where a lot of the equipment manufacturers and the OEMs is going to have a heart attack because it's virtually impossible for equipment, with the exception of loudspeakers and the room and our hearing and our listening capabilities, to influence the timing information. Yes, DSPs can do that. They can do it in certain frequency bands, but our hearing and listening capabilities are far more sophisticated than today's best DSPs, and they can't go and alter individual bits of timing inside all of those circuits. It is not really viable, and nothing is produced that is for the consumer market that can do this. I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but it will be prohibitively expensive to be able to do so, and we'll understand now why this is really the case. We utilize reflections and the timing differences in reflections. That's the second key component to be able to do the virtual positioning and imaging, and then therefore create the soundstage, is the timing information that we receive. Now, to be able to receive the timing information, we have to do stereo recording. That's why stereo recording was invented, to be able to capture that timing differences. That's the sole reason, is to attempt to create a better listening experience by capturing the timing differences in the music, reaching the two microphones busy doing the stereo recording. Or the mastering engineer will use things like auto panners, stereo wideners, or just multi-mono mics pan to various places in this virtual soundstage that they create to be able to do that. So why do I say that your equipment does not influence the soundstage. Apart from the loudspeakers, the room and the room treatment, and your relative position, and to a certain extent, the speaker's relative position inside the room. Let me explain how timing works as far as listening is concerned. There is something called the interaural time difference between our ears, ITD. It's a technical term. All the researchers and anybody in professional audio understand that and what the function is. So the physics of the ITD is what gives us binaural hearing. That is the reason why we can distinguish things in different places in front of us, or even if it is in front of us or above us or behind us. We know when we hear an aircraft flying overhead, we associate that sound with something that's in the sky, and our ears have been trained, and our brains really, not our ears as much, but our brains have been trained to understand that type of sound is above us, and we will look up to figure out where the heck this thing is. It's difficult normally to locate it because it's far away. Firstly, it's moving fast, and there is lots of other reflections. Just the air density differences can bend the sound and cause all sorts of artifacts that we don't place and position that aircraft properly. That's all due to timing issues. The wavelength of the sound, the longer the wavelength, the more difficult it becomes, and there are different ways that we then use to be able to understand the timing and use the timing in the positioning.
Let me just back up a little bit there. So if we say that timing is the issue, if inside an amplifier we have left and right channels, and the left channel is constructed slightly differently from the right channel, could that influence the timing in which the signals arrive at the speakers?
It will have to be a very bad delay of one channel versus the other channel to be able to make a real influence. And when I say very bad, with amplifiers, let me explain with one technical design criteria used in amplifiers, and that is the rise time. If you get an impulse sound, which is a sound that raises almost infinitely high in almost no time whatsoever, we are talking about picoseconds. It's normally measured in nanoseconds in amplifiers, or microseconds sometimes. And we can see that that is about 1,000 times less than the 35 milliseconds our ears use to do the integration in our ears, and the interaural differences. And I've got the numbers down a little bit later and exactly how much that must be out. So if the amplifier or the preamplifier or even the source would have the one channel delayed by more than that amount to the next channel, or left in comparison to right, yes, that could theoretically influence it, but I don't think that even some of the very cheapest amplifiers got that type of discrepancy between left and right. Volume is much less of an issue, so there are always little volume differences, but that will influence the distance that we perceive. That's got nothing to do with the horizontal or vertical placement of the imaging to form that soundstage. So it has to be a purposely designed amplifier with delay, or a DSP that is very badly configured to delay one speaker by a massive amount in comparison to anything else. So theoretically, yes, it is possible that that could happen, but that will just destroy the complete soundstage if it is that bad, because we'll pick up the second channel as an echo of the first, and it'll be so intermingled that intelligibility of the music notes or of speech, whatever, is going to go away completely. You won't be able to listen. That's the reality. I mean, in this recording system of mine, I'm monitoring on my headphones your voice and my voice. My voice, I'm monitoring directly at the microphones. I can't monitor my voice post recording. In other words, what is busy being recorded, the delay is just too big. So it confuses me completely. I'm unable to do so. I have to switch my headphones from the listening position to my interface to be able to listen to the real time, so as to not confuse the heck out of me.
Oh,
So,
loves it.
yeah, highly unlikely that amplifiers would cause that, or sources, or anything else.
Brilliant.
To give you an analogy, 35 milliseconds is approximately 12 meters in distance at the standard speed of sound, which means your one speaker has to be in the region of 8 to 15 meters different from the other speaker relative to you as the listener to be able to have that effect.
In terms of depth, yeah.
So
yeah.
now you can understand in an amplifier where we are talking about the rise time of the signal inside the preamplifier and power amplifier stages,
Yeah.
that it is just not, it's not something that you're going to easily encounter, not in the least. I have
Yeah.
certainly not, even with all my old valve equipment, ever had anything like that. Not that valves are slower than transistors, they're just different.
Yeah.
But even with a beginning understanding of 70 and 80-year-old valve equipment, no, that's never been a problem. That has never been a problem. Let me just find
Cool.
where I'm at in this thingy. I've spoken about the interaural differences. Timing is obviously a little bit more complex, and we can discriminate a lot finer than just the 35 milliseconds, and I'll cover that now. The interaural distance is about 120 millimeters between the average human ear. There are obviously differences, but it's not that great. What I'm going to do is I'll just show a picture of the sound source in the head on screen, so that what I'm talking about now will make a bit more sense. So stereo sources, or even before I get to stereo sources, if we listen to a person speaking or to a single musical instrument like a guitar or a violin or a trumpet or whatever, they produce a point source, which is a mono or a monaural sound source. And as we've established, we listen that with 2 ears, which gives us that stereo information to be able to determine the where the sound is placed in space. Now imagine for a moment that you've only got one ear. You can only listen with one ear. The other one is non-functional, or we don't have that. You will not be able to detect the spatial position of sound sources. If it's daylight and your eyes are open, yes, once again, they work together, the sensors, to be able to tell you. But if it's dark, good luck. If you've only got one ear, good luck. In the dark, you can't locate sounds because that information is just completely absent. So let me use this as an example. If you're at an airport and there's a big jet airplane with 2 jet engines, they both produce noise, which is random sounds. And both of those are point sources because it's a small defined area at the distance we are normally away from the aircraft. That those are 2 mono sources that we are listening to. We are hearing them as stereo and we can individually position them, but they are still not, that's not a stereo sound that's produced. If you take 2 guitar players or 2 violin players or 2 trumpet players or 2 whatever players, and they play their musical instruments and they perfectly in tune and they play perfectly in sync with each other, those are still 2 monaural sources. Yeah. And you can position them as such and you listen to them in stereo, but they are 2 things coming at you as single point sources. Now, as far as I'm aware, the only stereo sound or multi-sound thing that we can listen to is actually a stereo HiFi or a surround sound system, where they've captured the timing information and they are played back in a specific stereo mode. It breaks down the moment that you remove one of the speakers or you terminate that speaker, then the stereo image disappears. The same for multi-channel. If you remove everything at the back, it disappears. You don't have the same effect anymore. You can simulate it by using DSPs and all sorts of things, but still you don't get the same effect. So people refer to surround sound or Atmos or any of these things as super stereo, with a fair amount of truth in that. because it gives us a different soundstage. Might not be better than a stereo soundstage. It is certainly different. Some people might prefer that. That's up to the individual as well. I've got no skin in any of those games, so I'm just unpacking how we do it.
I'm sure we'll touch on soundbars later.
Not in this episode, but we can certainly talk about it. It's part of the one interesting thing. Most mastering engineers will place the vocals front and center. Take note, front and center in the soundstage. So because it's an individual person, although they use stereo imaging, the stereo imaging still places the vocalist front and center, and normally closer than what the instruments are, because that's the dominant sound source, the thing that the lyrics are what are part of the enjoyment of that music, obviously. So sound bars is part and parcel in the reproduction to give us not a virtual center, but a real center. Now, contrary to what we may think, we don't need a real center. It is a little bit more realistic than a virtual center, because now the system will direct the vocalist via the center channel, and sound bar is multiple speakers. And if it's more than a meter in width or a meter and a half in width, then, or at a meter and a half in width, I've proven with my setup here that at 1.5 meters, and I'm pretty sure if I move them closer, my monitor is in the way, but if I move them closer, I will still get a stereo image. At some point, it will fall apart, absolutely. But at the moment, at 1.5 meters. So for a sound bar or a center channel, that is certainly something that is enhancing that image. So we've now established that almost the only stereo source and multi-sound source are stereo HiFi systems and surround sound systems of various types, immaterial what they are. So I mentioned in locating sounds that our interaural distance, the distance between our ears, is very important. And to give you an idea of how important, there is a minimum audible angle that the technical people and the researchers refer to, and it's about 1 degree along the horizontal plane, about 2 degrees or 2 to 3 degrees on the vertical plane, let's say 3 degrees. And behind us, behind this 180 frontal area, it is a much less, probably an order of magnitude less than in front. So we've got the ability to position sounds much, much more accurately in front of us.
And it's this that allows us to position things accurately in our soundstage.
Yes, to a very, very large extent. 1 degree, if you think 180 degrees in front of us, we can accurately position with our eyes closed a sound in front of us to within 1 degree accuracy repeatedly. That's how accurate it is. As far as height is concerned, to about 3 degrees in height in front of us. So that is a very, very keenly developed sense.
So would that be impacted by speaker position? So in other words, if I had a speaker in front of me and I moved one speaker 20 centimeters forward and the other one 20 centimeters back?
A tiny, but 20 centimeters, as I've explained, is minute. That type of difference, it is always best to position your speakers left to right in the width of the room to have a balanced distribution, so that the speakers are equidistant from the side walls. And the reason is to assist us in not bedeviling the timing, the relative timing reaching our ears. It's complex enough as it is. And the mastering engineer, that artist, certainly, when he did the recording, his loudspeakers were equidistant in front of him, and they were the same distance from the side walls and the same distance from the front walls. That is to say, if the studio has got parallel walls, the studio might have 1 wall or 2 walls that are not parallel to the others. The ceiling frequently is not parallel to the floor. But on average, the reflections, the side reflections, and the reflections from behind should reach your ears at more or less the same time. The more timing differences, and this stacks up, the more those timing differences come in, the less intelligibility we will have of whatever it is that is being reproduced in that room. So it is important to attempt to keep that symmetrical as far as is possible, to be able to not mess with our ability to do that. 20 millimeter one side or even 20 centimeter one side might not, it won't kill your soundstage. Let me put it to you this way. It might take away from your soundstage a little bit, but it certainly won't destroy the soundstage completely. So once again, I've got the two heads with the various where the soundstage is, the point source of the sound is originating from, to illustrate. If it's directly in front of us, the sound will reach, and I mean really on it, directly in front of us, equidistant to our ears, the sound will reach our ears at the same time. If we move it off to 45 degrees or 30 degrees to one side, the sound will reach that side ear first. It'll be delayed to the other side ear, and depending on how far the sound stage has moved to the side of our head, at some point, one of our ears will be in the acoustical shadow of that sound source and the other one won't be. And these are all the things that our ears use to be able to do that. Now, let me get to, and I mentioned I'll give a few numbers just to put what your questions were asking in perspective. So the difference of the average difference between our ears gives rise to a 630 millisecond difference between the one ear, the sound reaching the one ear, if it's at 90 degrees to the left directly between or to the side of us, 90 degrees, 630 milliseconds more for the sound to reach. Once it's reached this ear, another 630 milliseconds to reach the other ear. Now, 630 milliseconds.
Microseconds.
Microseconds. I do beg your pardon. Sorry. Microseconds.
Yeah.
You're quite correct.
Milliseconds is like a lot more than 35 milliseconds.
Yeah, 35 milliseconds is the integration time of the ear. 650 microseconds. Thanks for that correction. Otherwise, the editor would have had to type up a lot of text again, saving him some time.
But it's a much narrower time break.
Yes, a lot smaller. So that is 0.63 of 100th of 1 second. That's how much that is. That's the time difference of the sound reaching this ear to reaching the ear that's furthest away from it. Now, for that discrimination between our ears, and I said our brains are slow. I mean, it only takes 16 things per second to fool our brain from a visual perspective. It's a bit faster on audio. And that time difference, and I'm going to read here so that I don't make the same mistake again. The time differences from the sides of our heads, although it's 630 milliseconds for the sounds to reach that, the sensitivity of our brain to distinguish things is about 8.5 to 20 microseconds that we can discriminate. And that's where that angle difference of 1 degree on the horizontal plane and 3 degrees on the vertical plane comes from, is from this, because between 8.5 to 20, and that's obviously based on the individuals, it can vary that much. That gives us in distance or in angle, that 1 or 2 angles is that 8 to 20 microseconds. Now, if we think that 630 microseconds is the difference from one ear to the other one, but 8.5 to 20 microseconds is how much we can distinguish. So the sound has only traveled to about here, and then we already know this ear hasn't heard the sound, and it'll wait. Okay, now I hear it. So because of only this difference, and this is just a relative indicator, that's why we can then now distinguish based solely on the timing information and the artifacts that our ears and the bandpass filters that our ears create before the sound actually enters, all the nulls and the peaks because of all the various frequencies that reaches our ear at that particular point in time, and all the various reflections. If we look at the pinna of our ear, all these various things has got one task, and that's reflecting different frequencies to get into our ear canal. All of those things is part and parcel of what forms this bandpass filter and what causes all of this. We're almost done. There's 2 more quick things, and we are almost running out of time again. So we've discussed the acoustical shadow. We understand that timing information is the vital link to help us form the soundstage. We've discussed a little bit about the amplifier and the amplifiers and the reproduction chain apart from the speakers in the room, and our position relative to all of that doesn't really influence the sound or the sound stage and the imaging by definition. We use this binaural listening ability. Now, 1,500 hertz and about 800 hertz are the other 2 frequencies. 1,500 hertz is the base frequency or mid-range frequency difference wavelength distance, which is this ear separation. And normally we are sensitive to at least half that distance. So, or a half wave. This is 1,500 hertz full wave. Above that is multiple waves. Less than that is less than that frequency. 800 hertz or 850 hertz or 750 hertz to 800 hertz is about the half wavelength that we are sensitive to. Now, below the 800 hertz frequency, or 750 or 700 for some people, we don't use the timing information anymore. We start using the phase information, which is caused by the timing information. But now, because there's not multiple waves and it doesn't take time to get here, the whole wave reaches both ears at the same time, although we've got this acoustical shadow. There are phase differences, and once again, our ear lobes, the pinna, are responsible for that, and that is what helps us to obviously then distinguish lower frequencies and deriving that cues for the soundstage from lower frequencies. I think at this point, I'm going to park it for this episode, and we'll have to be there will have to be a second one on this, part deuce.
I have questions.
So we've got a couple of minutes.